Well, good morning, everyone that's joined us by video stream or joined us by call. We apologize that we're a few minutes late. A lot has happened this week. We have begun the process of getting the church ready, and the big secret is now out. For those of you that thought those broadcasts were coming from the chapel, they were actually coming from our main room where we do fellowship and coffee. And different people have commented that they thought that was the chapel, but now we are actually in the chapel. And it feels like home. Kind of nice to be back in these open spaces, and this is a test run, and that's why we had a little bit of time getting things going, because we had a lot of things different when we moved all our equipment and all of our ways of processing. And so bear with us. This is our dry run, and we're going to start off with Esri singing a song that she just learned. I thought she would already know this one, but at 3 years of age, she hasn't had enough experience to learn about 12 spies that went to Canaan. So are we ready?
Slow the first time.
We're going to do it slow, and then we'll speed it up a little to normal speed. And if you're there in your home, nobody knows if you look silly. So do the actions. Have some fun with this. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't. 12 spies went to spy out Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. What do you think they saw in Canaan? 10 were bad and 2 were good. Some saw the giants great and tall. Some saw the grapes in clusters fall. Some saw God was in it all. 10 were bad and 2 were good. Okay, just a little faster. 12 spies went to spy out Canaan. 10 were bad, 2 were good. What do you think they saw in Canaan? 10 were bad, 2 were good. Some saw the giants great and tall. Some saw the grapes in clusters fall. Some saw God was in it all. 10 were bad and 2 were good. Good job, Esri. Thank you so much. And again, just a few announcements before we get started with our worship time. No prayer meeting this week. Wednesday, the day we normally have our online prayer meeting, is Canada Day, and so we've opted to not run the stream that day, and you can pray at home. I would encourage you to be praying for our nation on Canada Day. It might be a reminder, but otherwise it is a national holiday, and we want to give you opportunity to enjoy that day. And next Sunday, we are going to have communion, so be prepared for that, for communion next Sunday as best you can. And that kind of ties over into this next announcement, because if all goes well, we are hoping to have the doors open for next Sunday. Now, we are going to continue the video stream. That's why we're doing this here today, getting this set up so that we can continue this video broadcast. For those of you that feel you want to continue to do church from home in this fashion, either by video or by phone, that will continue. But for those that have wanted to come back to the churches, now that it is permissible to have churches up to 30% capacity, we put measures in place and are continuing to do that this week. And the thing we need to know, because some have expressed an interest in that, but we need to know for sure if you are interested in coming back physically. Basically, you're going to come to a very similar service to what you will see today, and just be present with us. Now, there are others that have also contacted us from outside this church. Their churches are not running services at this time, and a couple of people have asked about the possibility of joining us. And so we just need to know, for preparation, for numbers, what we need to look for next week. So please let us know by phone, by email, however you are able to contact us. And so with that said, if you are more comfortable staying at home at this present time for whatever reason, just do that and continue to support us with your prayers. We certainly appreciate the support, the financial support and offerings. I won't go through all that again, but continue to give as you have ability to do that. And I think that's all the announcements we really need to make at this time. So at this time, we're going to take some time and worship God. And as I said, this kind of feels like home. And so I hope this little shift, seeing the actual platform and staging, being able to see the other musicians is going to be helpful. And you can see all the things that happen supposedly off camera that are now all happening on camera, like Dan running and doing something at the soundboard there. The soundboard's up at the front now, but
You need to
speak up. I'm getting messages that I need to speak right into the microphone, but that gets it right up touching my lips. There is no God, there is no God like our God. No other name worthy of all our praise. Rock of salvation cannot be moved. He's proven himself to be faithful and true. There is no rock, there is no God like ours. There is no rock, there is no God like our God. No other name worthy of all our praise. It's the rock of salvation, cannot be moved. He's proven himself to be faithful and true. There is no rock, there is no God like ours. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. There is no rock, there is no God like ours. There is no rock, there is no God like our God. No other name is worthy of all our praise. The rock of salvation cannot be moved. He's proven himself to be faithful and true. There is no rock, there is no God like ours. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. There is no rock, there is no God like ours. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. Rock of ages, Jesus is the rock. There is no rock, there is no God like God. There is no rock, there is no God like God. Lord, we thank you. We thank you that we can always depend on you, that you are that rock that cannot be moved, that north star by which we orient our lives. And we thank you this morning that you have made yourself known to us. Lord, help us to hunger after you and more of you. Help us to come to you with open hearts. Thank you, Jesus. Hungry I
Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. Broken, I run to you, for your arms are open wide. I am weary, but I know your touch restores my life. So I wait for you. So I wait for you. I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. I'm falling on my knees, offering all of me. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. Jesus, you're all this heart is living for. One more song that talks about listening for God's voice, being ready to respond, knowing that He is everything that we long for and everything we seek.
When you speak, darkness has to bow, confusion has its final hour. When you speak, mountains rise and fall, it tears down every wall around me. When you speak, you breathe upon the dust, you come alive in us. When you speak, you silence every fear, we feel your spirit here around us. Let there be light, let there be light, until it fills up every space. Come and have your way. Let there be light, let there be light. Just one word and I am changed. Come and have your way. When you speak, darkness has to bow, confusion has its final hour. When you speak, mountains rise and fall, it tears down every wall around me. When you speak, you breathe upon the dust, you come alive in us. When you speak, you silence every fear, we feel your spirit here
This morning, I want to share a message that I think just resonated with me this week as I was thinking about the story of Joshua and Caleb. And the title, if I had a title for my message, is Faith When Things Seem Impossible. When Israel arrived at the edge of the promised land, promised by God, Moses sent 12 spies to see what they would be up against. 10 of the spies, as we sang about in our children's song earlier, 10 of the spies brought back news of giants and impenetrable walls. But 2 of them brought back news of great natural beauty, of huge clusters of grapes and wealth and all the good things, the land of milk and honey that God had promised them. These 2 young men were Joshua and Caleb. They trusted God that he would help them take the land. Unfortunately, they, with the rest of the people, spent the same next 40 years wandering in the wilderness with all the other Israelites. But one thing that set Joshua and Caleb apart from the rest was that they had faith that God would bring them back to that land that he had promised them, that they had spied out 40 years earlier. Some say 38. Depends on how you interpret the time it took them to get there the first time. They were the only 2 people who left Egypt who were allowed to go into that land of promise, at least of those that were 20 or more when they left Egypt, because they had faith in the God who had promised it. Going back to the first time they arrive at the borders of Canaan, the promised land, which would become the land of Israel. 12 spies returned from scouting out the land of Canaan to report to Moses and the people of Israel. The people were all filled, I'm sure, with eagerness. God himself had led them up from Egypt, and finally this moment of truth had arrived. 40 days ago, Moses had sent them out as spies with instructions to find out as much as they could before the Israelites would enter the land and take it as their own. Numbers chapter 13 and verse 18. It says, "See what the land is like." That is Moses beginning his charge. And then he gives detailed instructions. I won't read all the parts of the verses in between, but finishing with verse 20, he says, "Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land." So Moses, and some have criticized Moses, maybe he shouldn't have sent spies. We all like to criticize after somebody has done something in leadership and say, well, they could have done it a different way. Whatever you think about that, he was looking for what God had promised. He said, bring back some of the fruit, which they did. Numbers chapter 13, verse 23. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. Now, I don't know if you've bought grapes from the grocery store, or maybe you've had the privilege to grow grapes. Probably this part of the world isn't the best part of the world to grow grapes, but that single cluster of grapes, where we think of going and getting a cluster of grapes, we're thinking of something, maybe a big cluster of grapes might be, like this and weigh about a pound or 2. They brought back a single cluster of grapes, and it said 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. It was so large, it took 2 men carrying it on a pole between them to carry it. I'm not sure if they were like giant grapes or just a lot of them. I'm expecting they were large grapes, but a lot of them. But I can't even fathom that kind of produce. And here they were carrying this bunch of grapes so large that they had to carry it between them. Numbers chapter 13 and verse 27. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. And here they were carrying it back saying, and I mean, this sounds really good at this point. It's not hard to picture the people very excited as they saw them coming, and they were, what are they carrying? And then they got closer and said, that's grapes. Like, I've never seen anything like that. Understanding that they came as slaves out of Egypt, they got very meager food at the best of times. And they're looking at this luscious grapes. I try to get my mind kind of in their zone. And they gather around to see for themselves. Everyone wants to have a share in the fruit. This was the evidence of the land of promise, the inheritance given to Abraham and down through the generations by faith, and now visible before their eyes. And when I picture that, I picture them carrying those grapes in, and I picture everybody gathering around all excited. This is the land that flows with milk and honey. This is the land that God has brought us to. I picture the church celebrating good times. And I've seen that. I've seen churches full of people, and they're excited, and they even have a church song that they, I think, adopted from a secular song, Celebrate Good Times. Come on. And they get the crowd all pumped up. That's what I picture when I see this scene. The New Covenant also, or the New Testament, the church age, we've been told, instructed to take a promised land. Not a physical land. The Jewish people took a physical land. There's reasons for physical pictures of spiritual things. But as Christians, we have the greatest and most precious promises to be finished with sin and be partakers of a relationship with Christ and a transformation from this fallen human nature to his divine nature. That's the promised land for us as Christians, as followers of Christ. 2 Peter chapter 1, and I'll read verses 3 and 4. And there's lots of verses in the New Testament that talk about this, but I chose just one of those verses. 2 Peter 1, 3 and 4. Praise be to God, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you. I mean, fruit spoils. Grapes are great when they're fresh and ripe, but this is a promise of fruit that doesn't ever perish. The fruits of this land, this new land that God has invited us to be partakers of in Christ, are the virtues and the blessings that we receive. A living hope and all that goes with that. Who doesn't want all the good things that God has promised? To live in peace, to live in a spiritual and emotional and physical prosperity, to have all the blessings of God showered upon us, and nothing any less than his love and mercy. And the next verse in Israel's story starts with a word that we all hate. It's great to have promises of great things, and the Israelites were looking at the borders of a land of promise, and it was a beautiful land, and then there's that word, but. Numbers chapter 13, verse 28. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. Everything was going good. They were celebrating. They were showing off the grapes. This is a land filled with milk and honey, but there are giants in the land. I love Caleb. God would later say of Caleb, he was of a different spirit and follows God wholeheartedly. God saw Caleb's heart. He sees our heart. Each of the spies were from a different tribe. Does anybody know or remember which tribe Caleb was from? Do you want to guess? It was the tribe of Judah. Surprise, surprise. The same tribe from which Jesus was to come. Caleb did not flinch at an enemy that has a few giants in the mix. Now dropping down to Numbers 13 and verse 30. So all of this commotion is going on. Some of them are stirring up all the fears about the giants in the land and all the things that are problematic. It says, then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, I mean, I can hear him just running into the crowd saying, guys, quiet, quiet, quiet. I've got something to say. He silenced the crowd and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. There was no question. And when he said we can go up and take the land, for we can certainly do it, we included God. That's really why he had that confidence. It wasn't because he thought they were such a massive warring people that nobody could stand before them in a physical sense. He'd already seen what God could do. And he said, we plus God equal a majority. If he says take the land, we'll take the land. The very next verse, verse 31, but, there it is again. He's trying to encourage them. He's trying to say, yeah, let's go, let's do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. We seemed to be like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Now, I think they exaggerated a little bit. I don't think all the people they saw were giants, but that's just me. But they did see these Nephilim, these sons of Anak. Obviously, they knew about this because the first time Nephilim appears in Scripture, sometimes the word actually is translated giants. They were first mentioned in Genesis chapter 6, before the flood. And if you look in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, it describes them. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. This is the days of Noah, the days before Noah's flood. From Adam to Noah, there was a dispensation where the earth was full of people, and among them were these Nephilim. Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Now, there are different beliefs about the Nephilim, who they are, what they were. But one understanding in Jewish tradition and among some Christian scholars is that they, when it refers to the sons of God, they were referring to fallen angels, otherwise known as demons. Notice it says, though, whether you accept that or you don't accept that, I'll leave that to you to figure out. But if you want to just picture that for a minute, notice it says also afterward. So they were there before the flood, and then, of course, the flood killed everybody except Noah and his family. You would think, well, good, we got rid of those guys. But it says, and also afterward. And it suggests, to me anyway, that it's possible that this joining of demonic, angelic beings and humans to create powerful offspring happened again at some point. And somehow they knew about that, because when they saw these very large and powerful humans, they said they were Nephilim, sons of Anak. Not a story to be told around the campfire when you're just about to go to sleep. And I will leave that to you to deal with that as you will, but they were terrified when they saw these very large men. And there were some large men, because there's other descriptors that talk about that, including Goliath later on. The people of Israel sank into a despondency. They just became very, very upset and very depressed. They wept aloud the whole night they wept through. They had all their hopes tied up in this promise that they were going to be not just delivered from Egypt, but brought into a land of promise. I think they thought they were going to walk in like you walk into some posh hotel, and the whole hotel is reserved for you and your crew, and you get the whole penthouse floor, and everything's paid for. They had this picture that it was going to just be a cakewalk Don't know if you know what that means. Look it up. And they get there, and all of their hopes are dashed, so they think. Had they really suffered so much hardship only to be thwarted at the very threshold of the promised land? And I'm not minimizing the suffering that they went through as slaves living in Egypt. The statement that seemed to me to be the definitive moment in that last portion that we read was that verse 33. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. How they saw themselves, to assume that that's how they really were and how the inhabitants of Canaan saw them, was the biggest problem. They had this idea that they were nothing. And I mean, coming out of slavery, it's understandable that they would think that they were of a lower class, a lower strength. They were beaten down. They were told they were weak. They were nothing but slaves. Now they've come out of that, and they really haven't had a time for a full mind shift. And then they go in and they see these even probably more powerful looking people than what they had left in Egypt. And they're thinking, oh my goodness, we are like grasshoppers. That's how they saw themselves. And then they said, and that's how they saw us. Now, I want to just step out of that for a moment. We're going to move ahead in the narrative. Later, when they did enter Canaan, and God supernaturally destroyed the first big city that they come up against, Jericho, with its huge walls, towering walls, all of its fortifications. And they did not physically have to do anything to penetrate those walls. They didn't have to come up with any scientific thing. They didn't have to call for nukes. They simply marched around because God told them to do that. And on the last day, when they made the last march and they blew the trumpets, something happened that was supernatural, and the walls crumbled. They came down, and they went in and they defeated those people. So they've had this great victory, and they're moving along, and there were a people called the Gibeonites. And they were some of the people, if you want to think about it, that would have been the ones that they spied out 40 years earlier, that they said, they see us as grasshoppers. Well, these Gibeonites did not see it that way. They were so scared of these guys that they made a plan to dress themselves like they've been traveling for a long time. They even put moldy bread in their packs and everything, and wore old clothes and shoes that were almost worn out. And they said, we have traveled for so long and for so far because we heard of your great God. They're schmoozing and they're deceiving Joshua. And they're saying this. This is Joshua chapter 9 and verses 9 and 10. This is what they said. They answered, your servants have come from a very distant country. Because of the fame of the Lord your God, we have heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites east of Jordan. Those were battles they fought before they got there. But notice, they knew what happened in Egypt. The people of Canaan did not all see the Israelites like little grasshoppers. The spies gave a bad report where they imagined that their feelings of intimidation and fear were what the Canaanites felt about them. But more importantly, they assumed their weakness was greater than God's power to help them. And God had already set the stage. Somehow or other, those people knew about what had gone on in Egypt. And they weren't going to be just all proud and powerful. I mean, they would have fought for their land, but I think it was important to note that the bad spies, the spies that gave the evil report that angered God and caused all the problems for the next little piece of time, it was their problem. They were themselves not having faith. But Joshua and Caleb had faith when a situation looked impossible. I want to believe like that. Do you want to believe like Joshua and Caleb, or like the other guys that just saw every problem and then caved? Often it can seem like that in our Christian lives. We give up our old life to follow Jesus with high hopes of a better one, but then our enemy and our old sin nature looms up large and threatening, seems impossible to overcome. It can be circumstances, it can be personal things, it can be things that are a combination of the two, usually are. We begin to feel that being a Christian is going to cost too much, that it's too much work. Why doesn't God help us when we really need it? The fact is, He does. And if you've walked with God for any number of years and been a person that has looked to God in faith for answers in difficult situations, you might go back in your own history and see some of those times. I go back to when Dan was just an infant and he was tested positive of a disease called meningitis. And while it wasn't a pandemic, it was a pandemic for our family because we were told he probably wouldn't live the day. They rushed him to sick kids to see if they could do anything, but they said, don't expect him to survive this. We don't know what happened on that ambulance ride down to Toronto. We followed in our car and we prayed. Other people were alerted and they were praying. And they were saying, God, this is impossible. This is something that we have no power for, but we know you are powerful. We don't know what you will do, but we know that we can trust you. And we said to God in the car as we traveled down there, God, whatever happens, we will trust you. And if you need to take him at this time, we will accept that, but just help us through the funeral, help us through the days ahead of that. But you know our heart. We want to see a miracle here. We arrived in Toronto. We waited agonizingly for hours. Finally, somebody came out, and through those doors where they'd been working on Dan and working with him, and they said, we don't know what happened in Lindsay at that hospital or what that test was about, but we can't find a trace of meningitis. God is a God who meets us in impossible situations. My sister Zena and her husband Terry, their daughter Holly, and her daughter Katie faced an impossible situation. A couple of years ago, she had a strange disease, very, very rare. I won't go into all the details, but they thought she wouldn't survive. At the age of 15, she goes down to sick kids, and they said, we'll do what we can. Now she has been released from hospital, and her body was definitely damaged by this virus that raced through her system. And she is smiling. I saw some pictures of her. She's doing great. She had to have a kidney transplant in the end because it destroyed her kidneys till the point where they weren't functioning. The rest of the organs, which they thought wouldn't recover, did recover. God did some miracles straight up, and others he allowed the medical system to be a part of. I don't care how God gets the job done. He was there in an impossible situation. And because of that, she's still living and breathing. And she got to the door of death several times in that journey. Others of you, maybe not that dramatic a story, but you have stories where God has met you. But God can't help those who don't want to believe or ask for his help. He has too much respect for the free will that he's given us to override that free will. In fact, without faith, it says in Hebrews, it is impossible to please God. On the other hand, he richly rewards those who diligently seek him. So we have a choice, like they had back in the days of Joshua and Caleb. Are they going to believe the good report and go into the land? Or are they going to believe the bad report, the evil report, and say, we can't do this, and God isn't enough to overcome the difference? And it's not just for us. You know, you might say if you're my age or older, you know what, we'll do the best we can. I mean, right now we're facing a very difficult situation, especially for older people, because this COVID-19 is a disease that is much less survivable if you're older. And we've seen the statistics. We know that it is ravaging, especially the senior population. And you could say, well, you know what, I'll get through this or I won't get through this. But it's not for you. Only it is for your children. The children of this next generation are watching to see how we are responding. Are we responding in fear and throwing up our hands and saying, God can't help us? Or are we saying, we don't know what this is about and we don't know how God will do it, but God and us, we are able to face this giant. And our kids can see that and they will stand with us. And I want to bring Pam on camera, and I want her to introduce something we're going to do as our closing today.
Brian and I were discussing this morning about just the whole thing of Joshua and Caleb, and that they believed when no one else did. They believed in the impossible. And as we were discussing that, I said to Brian, the Apostle Paul, he wrote in the New Testament, he said these stories that have been passed down through our generations, the Jewish generations, he said they're written down, they are preserved for us and the future generations. Because a lot of times people see it and they only see it as history and, oh, that's a fascinating story, even if they believe it or don't believe it. But the story's there to say, I am still the God of the impossible. I can make things happen when no one else can. Interestingly enough, when Brian talked about Holly and her daughter Katie, and she had a bad cold that was coming on, and Holly was starting to get it. And just this past week, she says, would you guys begin to pray? Because she says, we can't get to the hospital very easy, and there's still things that are happening with her kidney transplant, that she needs to be go every day to be monitored and stuff. And she says, we need this gone. And so so we began to pray, and other people began to pray. And when they did that, she just announced last night, she says, guess what? She says, the cold never happened. She says, it stopped in its tracks. And she says, for both me and Katie. And she says, I just want to thank God for that. It doesn't matter whether it's big or small. God is still the God of the impossible. And so when you look at this story, both Joshua and Caleb believed for something bigger, even though the signs said not possible. And so when 40 years was up, they were the only two of that generation to still go in because they believed. But they also remembered that they need to remind the people that were coming through with them. They said, you guys need to tell this to your children and your children's children, because otherwise it will be robbed from them to know how great God is, how powerful He is. He can do the impossible. And so one of the very first things that happened when the Israelites crossed the river of Jordan, and God had to do a miracle even for them to get across that, Joshua said, I want all of the tribes to pick up a rock, a large rock from the Jordan River, and place it on the other side as a memorial stone. I want you to build a sort of like a statue, only with rocks, a pile of rocks. And he says, every time your children and your children's children look at those rocks, they're going to say, why are those rocks there? And you're going to begin to tell the story again, how that God can meet you at the impossible. If He asks you to do something, He's not setting you up for failure. He says, I can do what you can't do. And so this morning, we wanted to finish with something. I know last week we used the song, The Blessing, and it was Canadians singing over their country. And different people in the world have sung over their country, God's favor and blessing upon the people. But then somebody sent this to me, and it was so moving. I just felt we needed to share it one more time instead of to finish as we've been finishing for the past while of Aaron's blessing. As I've mentioned, it was called before. There's one that was done by children, and they're children across the world. It's not just one country. And sometimes, Satan can kind of whisper in your ear to say, what's the use? You watch the population getting older, and it seems like there isn't going to be a next generation. And yet this video that's about to play of these children singing, there is a different generation. There is a generation that is rising up that will serve God and serve Him well. And it's our job to support them in this. And so, and the other thing is that sometimes, especially in isolation, you feel like you're the only one. I don't know if you remember the story of Elijah, where he said to God, I'm the only one left. And Elijah said, there are 7,000 people that have not bowed to Satan. He says, they're me. They're with me. And so if you're believing that lie sometimes, that it's like, I'm a little church, or I'm by myself and there doesn't really seem to be anybody, you need to know God still knows where everybody is. And there's a lot more than 7,000 that have not bowed. And so this morning as we close, I just want you to, if you can, I know there's people on phone, if you want to, I don't know if you can even listen through the phone of the children's voices. There were several ones that actually touched me deeply. A couple of babies that looked like they were singing the song, but there were some children with some learning challenges and that, and it will just really touch your heart to remind us again. Joshua, Caleb, believed in the impossible. We can believe in the impossible for these children. The church will go on. And so I give you blessings and peace this week, but I'm just going to have it finish with the song, The Blessing from Children Singing Across the World. Thank you.